Can you all see that?
Yes.
Good. Okay. So we're going to talk about today, we're going to talk about part A and part B of chapter 12, which is the central nervous system. The brain regions are four in the adult brain. You have cerebral hemispheres, the diencephalon, the brain stem, which consists of the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla, and then you have the cerebellum. And this is what the brain looks like. This is the cerebrum, or the cerebral hemisphere. This is known as the diencephalon. This is known as the brain stem, which includes the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla, and the cerebellum. So those are the four regions of your brain. We talked about gray matter and white matter before, but just as a review, gray matter is non-myelinated neurons. Remember, myelin is the protein that's laid down by some of the neuroglial cells that makes transmission of nerve impulses faster and quicker. But gray matter is non-myelinated. It has no white matter. White matter is basically myelinated axons. So when you see the word white matter, you should always think of myelin. Always think of myelin. The basic pattern that's found in the central nervous system is that the central cavity, which I'll show you, is surrounded by gray matter. And outside of the gray matter, there is white matter, because white matter transmits all the nerve impulses. So here is what we're talking about. This is gray matter. This is all gray matter, okay? And outside of the gray matter is all white matter. That's the usual way that the nervous system reacts. And as you can see, gray matter is nerve cell bodies, neurons. And white matter is mostly myelinated axons, or the tracks of neurons. The brainstem has additional gray matter because inside the brainstem there are nuclei. Remember, nuclei in the central nervous system is a cluster of neurons. So that's what gray matter is in the central nervous system. In the peripheral nervous system, when you have a cluster of gray matter, it's a different thing. It's not called nuclei anymore, okay? So that's important, that's important. And this is the same slide, actually, the same slide as before. Okay, the ventricles. The ventricles of the brain are fluid-filled chambers that are continuous to one another, and also the central canal of the spinal cord. The ventricles are important because they all contain cerebral spinal fluid. And as you remember from chapter 11, the neuroglial cells, the ependymal cells, they function to swarm the cerebral spinal fluid. So the ependymal cells line the ventricles. They line the ventricles. Someone has their microphone on. Can you please turn it off? Thanks. There are 4 ventricles. There are lateral ventricles, which are connected to the 3rd ventricle via a foramen called the interventricular foramen. The 3rd ventricle lies below the cerebrum in the diencephalon. The 3rd ventricle is connected to the 4th ventricle. And this is the important thing I want you to know about the ventricles. The 3rd ventricle and the 4th ventricle are connected to each other by the cerebral aqueduct. The word aqueduct means a passageway for fluid or water. So the 3rd and 4th ventricle are connected by a large passageway called the cerebral aqueduct. And the 4th ventricle is continuous with the spinal cord. So the spinal fluid goes in the ventricles of the brain and also into the spinal cord. So that's where your spinal fluid lies, okay? And that's important. Here are the ventricles. Here are the ventricles, okay? You have lateral ventricles, the 3rd ventricle, and the 4th ventricle, which goes into the spinal cord. This is where all this blue is where your spinal fluid is. Your spinal fluid is. It bathes the brain, okay? It bathes the brain. The cerebrum. The cerebral hemispheres are basically the majority of your brain. You don't have to know 83%, that's really not important. But what you should know about the cerebral hemispheres is that there are certain markings on them that are very important. Gyri, or gyrus, singular, are ridges. Sulci, or grooves, shallow grooves. Fissures are deep grooves, and fissures are very important, especially this one. The longitudinal fissure separates the right and the left cerebral hemispheres. You don't have to know the transverse cerebral fissure, but I certainly would know the longitudinal fissure. Here is the longitudinal fissure. Here it is. This big groove that separates the left cerebral hemisphere from the right cerebral hemisphere. Okay, and here you can see the lobes of the cerebrum. Here is the frontal lobe. This is an anterior section. Here's the frontal lobe. Here's the parietal lobe. And here is the occipital lobe. Okay, so those are the big lobes of the cerebral hemisphere. The ones that's not shown right now is the temporal lobe, but we'll show you that in a few minutes. As a matter of fact, we'll show it right now. Here's the temporal lobe. Okay, so this is anterior. Here is the frontal lobe. Here is the parietal lobe. Here is the occipital lobe. And here is the temporal lobe. Okay, so that's important. The hemispheres are divided actually into 5 lobes. We talked about the frontal lobe. We talked about the parietal lobe, the temporal lobe, the occipital lobe, and the 5th lobe is the insula. The insula basically is underneath these 4 lobes. We'll show you where that is, okay? The first 4 are named for the bones that protect them. The frontal bone protects the frontal lobe. The occipital bone protects the occipital lobe, and so on. The insula is buried underneath portions of the temporal parietal, and frontal lobes. Here again is the frontal lobe. Here is the parietal lobe. Here is the occipital lobe. Here is the temporal lobe. And underneath these three lobes is the insular. Now, I want to take this opportunity to show you some very important words. The precentral gyrus is in the frontal lobe. The postcentral gyrus is in the parietal lobe. Okay? So, and they are separated, the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe are separated by a central sulcus, a shallow groove. These three words are so important, and you'll see them on exam number 3. Precentral gyrus, central sulcus, and postcentral gyrus. We'll talk about all three. Okay? And here is the insula. The insula is underneath the three lobes of the cerebrum. Here we go. The central sulcus separates the precentral gyrus of the frontal lobe and the postcentral gyrus of the parietal lobe. We will talk more about the precentral gyrus and the postcentral gyrus. These are the three words I want you to know on this slide. The other words on this slide really are not important. This sentence is probably the most important part of this slide. Again, the precentral gyrus is in the frontal lobe. The postcentral gyrus is in the parietal lobe. And the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe are separated by a shallow groove called the central sulcus. The cerebral cortex. The cerebral cortex is what doctors refer to as your brain. It is the executive suite. It is the site of conscious mind. It is your awareness. It is your sensory perception. It is your voluntary motor function. It's the way you communicate. It's the way you store memory and the way you understand. And it is 40% of your brain. How do we know which part of the brain controls what? Well, we can do that by imaging, PET scans and MRIs. And here we see that the occipital lobe is concerned with sight. The temporal lobe is concerned with hearing. And here we have parts of the parietal lobe and the temporal lobe, which is with speaking. And the majority of your brain all over is thinking. Okay, so seeing, hearing, speaking, and thinking are all functional neural images of your cerebral cortex. There are three types of functional areas in your cerebral cortex. There's a motor area, which controls your voluntary movement. There's a sensory area, which controls your awareness of sensation. And then there is association areas, which integrate both the motor and sensory areas. Each hemisphere is concerned with the opposite side of the body. That's known as contralateral. So your right brain controls the left side of your body, and your left brain controls the right side of your body. There is also what we call lateralization, which is a special function of the cortex that occurs in only one hemisphere. The majority of people in the United States are left hemisphere dominant. The majority of people in the United States are right-handed. That's what's called lateralization. Conscious behavior involves the entire cortex, both left and right. The motor areas. The motor areas are located in the frontal lobe. The frontal lobe controls voluntary movement. The reason I wanted you to know the precentral gyrus of the frontal lobe is because inside of that is your primary motor cortex. So the frontal lobe controls voluntary movement, and in the precentral gyrus is your primary motor cortex.
Images coming out of Miami, spring breakers really embrace the move. Florida
Oh, someone should turn off their microphone.
COVID restrictions. Now local officials have declared a state of emergency, imposing a citywide curfew.
Someone has on a television, I think.
Down a little too hard on
I have a question real quick.
Go.
So the left side of your brain controls what your like right side does. Like if I'm like right-handed, my left side of my brain. Did you say that?
Yes, I did.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
That makes sense?
Yeah, that does.
Okay. That's called contralateral control. Okay? The left side controls the right, and the right side controls the left in 90% of people. I don't want you to go ahead.
And can you go over the lateralization again, please?
Yeah, what lateralization means is that I'll give you a typical example. If you have a stroke and you're paralyzed on your right side, you will be unable to speak. And the reason you're unable to speak is because the left side of your brain not only controls motor function, but controls the thought process in speaking. And that is usually on the left side of your brain. So that's what lateralization means. Did that make any sense?
Yeah, it did.
Okay, all right. But what I want you to know is the precentral gyrus of the frontal lobe is the primary motor cortex. It controls voluntary movement. Voluntary movement. Okay? Here again, here is your primary motor cortex. It is in the frontal lobe because the frontal lobe is the motor cortex. It is in the precentral gyrus. This is the precentral gyrus, the primary motor cortex. Okay? The primary motor cortex, here it is again, is located in the precentral gyrus of the frontal lobe, okay? How do we know this? Well, we know this because we've mapped out the motor cortex. And you probably don't want to hear this, but how do we map that out? We take the skull off of a monkey, we put the monkey to sleep, and we take electrical probes, and we put probes in the frontal lobe and we watch and see where we put the probe, what happens to the monkey's motor function. So here is the motor cortex of the brain. If we put a probe right about here in the motor cortex, you will stick your tongue out. That's how we know the function of the motor cortex. And you can kind of see it. You can kind of see the arm, the elbow, the wrist. Look how big these things are compared to the elbow, because we use our fingers much more than we use our elbow. So we need to have all these fingers involved. You also look at your face, how big it is compared to your arms and legs. Okay? This is the primary motor cortex in the precentral gyrus. There it is. And if you look at the parietal lobe, here's the parietal lobe. This is the sensory lobe, okay? The hand is much bigger because your hands are very sensitive to touch. And this is sensory. This is all sensory. This is in the postcentral gyrus. The parietal lobe is a sensory lobe. The frontal lobe is a motor lobe. And it is separated by the central sulcus, So this is an important slide showing you that the primary motor cortex is in the precentral gyrus, and the primary somatosensory cortex is in the postcentral gyrus, separated by the central sulcus. Okay? What does the premotor cortex do? It helps you plan your movements. You're able to play a piano. You're able to clap your hands. It's a coordinated, simultaneous, sequential actions. It controls your voluntary actions. The premotor cortex of the frontal lobe. There's also an area in the frontal lobe called Broca's area. And Broca's area is motor speech, the actual ability to speak that directs the muscles of speech. How you move your mouth and how you move your tongue. It is only present in one hemisphere. The majority of the world is left hemisphere dominant. So it's usually on the left 90% of the time. Okay? So if you have a stroke and you are paralyzed, somebody has their microphone on, and you're paralyzed.
No.
Well, where?
Guys, somebody turn their microphone off.
I don't know. Inside of the street?
Microphone, guys, microphone.
You're rude as hell.
Yeah. Okay. Okay.
You are.
I want to go to sleep.
Hey, somebody's sleeping. Turn your microphone off.
Yeah?
Here.
Getting physical?
You want to put your little guy on?
Oh boy. Be careful, guys. So Broca's area is motor speech. What does motor speech mean? That means if you have a stroke in your left hemisphere and you're paralyzed on your right side, you will be unable to speak the correct words because the muscles of your mouth will not be able to work. Motor speech is in Broca's area.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? So again, the primary motor cortex
Are you done?
is in the
Are you going to throw
pre-central.
it at me
I
again?
didn't mean to throw it.
Guys, somebody's got their microphone on. Turn it off.
It's Emily.
Primary motor cortex is in your precentral gyrus. Motor. Okay? Here it is, right there. Motor. Again, damages to this area, like in a stroke, you'll have paralyzed muscles. You'll be paralyzed on the right side and be unable to speak because the muscles of speech are paralyzed. Okay? That is extremely important to understand. Sensory areas. We're now moving away from the frontal lobe, and now we're going into the parietal lobe. The majority of sensation is in your parietal lobe, but also there are other areas of sensation, and they are in the temporal lobe for hearing and in the occipital lobe for sight. And there are 8 main areas. The primary somatosensory cortex and the somatosensory association cortex are in your parietal lobe. The visual areas are in your occipital lobe. The auditory areas, the vestibular areas, these are all hearing and balance, are in your temporal lobe. The olfactory, which is smell, and the gustatory, which is taste, and the visceral sensory areas in your gut are in the temporal and insular areas of your brain. But I want to focus on the primary somatosensory cortex because it is in the postcentral gyrus of the parietal lobe. It receives sensory information from your skin, from your skeletal muscle, from your joints, and from your tendons. And all sensory input goes into the postcentral gyrus of the parietal lobe. Okay? Now we are in the somatosensory cortex of your parietal lobe. It is in the postcentral gyrus. This is where all the sensory information comes into. Here it is. All the sensory information comes into your postcentral gyrus, your somatosensory cortex. The visual areas are in your occipital lobe. Basically, that's what you should know. Primary visual cortex is in your occipital lobe. There is another area in your occipital lobe called the visual association area. And basically, this is an area that tells you, oh, I've seen this before. I've seen my house before. I've seen Johnny before. It's an ability to recognize something from past experiences. It is an association area. Remember, the association area are areas that understand what you are looking at. In this case, it's a visual association area. The auditory areas. The primary auditory cortex is in your temporal lobe. Okay? So you can hear from your temporal lobe. But how do you understand it is from your auditory association area. You're driving down the road and you hear an ambulance or a police siren. You've heard it before. What do? You pull over and let the ambulance or the policeman go by. Hopefully the policeman will go by and not stop and arrest you. Okay? Memory. Auditory association area is memory. And both of these auditory areas are in the temporal lobe. The vestibular cortex. The vestibular cortex is balance. It is part of balance. And it shares its abilities in two areas, the insular area and the parietal area. It is conscious awareness of balance, the cerebral cortex or the vestibular cortex. The olfactory cortex is smell, and smell is in the temporal lobe. Smell is in the temporal lobe. It is involved in conscious awareness of odors. The gustatory cortex. The gustatory cortex is taste. You have taste buds on your tongue, but the part of the brain that tells you that you're eating potato chips or a steak is the temporal lobe. Okay? The visceral sensory area is the perception of a full bladder, an upset stomach, vomiting. That is also in your temporal lobe. All right? So those are the major sensory areas of your brain. All right? Again, motor is frontal, sensory is parietal, and everything behind it. Okay? Very important. Broca's area is in the frontal lobe because it is a motor function. It's the muscles of speech. Broca's area. There is a sensory area of speech, and that sensory area is called Wernicke's area. Wernicke's area is the sensory area of speech. What does that mean? That means that you're able to recognize something, but you can't get the words out. You can't get the words out. You see a clock, you know it's a clock, but you can't say the word clock, not because your muscles of speech are bad, it's because the sensory perception of a clock has been disrupted. There are many association areas. Remember, association areas are basically sensory areas in which you have sensation and thoughts and emotions from a previous experience. You see someone and you realize that you've seen them before, and there's a bad experience in your brain when you see this person, or there's a good experience in your brain when you see this. These are called multimodal association areas, and they're all in the parietal area. Okay? The other association areas are not important. Tumors are extremely rare. I'm sure that you have heard of Alice in Wonderland, and you know it was written by Lewis G. Carroll. It is assumed that Lewis G. Carroll took LSD, and when he took LSD, he saw all of the characters in Alice in Wonderland. He saw the Cheshire Cat. He saw Tweedledum and Tweedledee because LSD, a psychedelic drug, affects the association areas of the parietal lobe. Okay? And he became famous for authoring Alice in Wonderland. Another thing about lateralization, 90% of humans have left-sided dominance. That means they're right-handed. Only 10% of people have the opposite hemisphere dominance. All right? The left hemisphere controls language, controls math, controls logic, where the right hemisphere is concerned with artistic ability, visual, spatial skills, intuition, emotion, artistry, and musical skills. We now leave the cortex. And we go into the other parts of the brain. Are there any questions before we go into the other parts of the brain? I know this is a lot of material.
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
The lobes of the brain, besides knowing the bones, are there like markings to distinguish? Like if you were looking at the brain bare?
Yes, there are divisions. That's why I talked to you about one of the divisions, the central sulcus. The central sulcus divides the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe.
Oh, okay.
And there are other sulci, but the only important one I want you to know is the central sulcus. Okay? All right. Okay. No problem. All right. We talked about gray matter. Now let's talk about white matter. There are regions of the cerebral cortexes that have white matter. And these are fibers. They are tracts of axons, and they connect parts of the brain. And there are 3 types of tracts or white matter. They are responsible for communications between each hemisphere and between the cortex of the cerebrum and other parts of the brain. And they consist of white myelinated fibers bundled into tracts. And there are 3 types. There are association, commissural, and projection fibers. Association fibers. They are horizontal running fibers that connect different parts of the same hemisphere. Commissural fibers. Whenever you see this word commissural, it means that the 2 hemispheres are connected. The commissural fibers connect the right and the left hemispheres together. Whenever you see projection fibers, these are vertical fibers that connect the hemisphere with the lower brain and spinal cord. These are the 3 fibers I want you to know. This is the only important thing on this slide, the 3 fibers. Know them. And basically, here they are. The association fibers are within the same hemisphere. They're in red. They connect the frontal lobe with the parietal lobe. The commissural fibers connect both frontal lobes. Look, they're in green. They cross over. And the projection fibers connect the cerebral cortex with the lower spinal column and the other parts of the brain. And here they are: association fibers, commissural fibers, and projection fibers. Know all three. All right? The basal nuclei. The basal nuclei are in the cerebrum. And they basically are three important nuclei. And those three important nuclei are the caudate nucleus, the putamen, and the globus pallidus. I'm not going to ask you any questions on these nuclei. I'm going to ask you questions on the word nuclei. A cluster of gray matter neurons in the brain. The reason we have the word ganglia here is because ganglia is a cluster of neurons in the peripheral nervous system. So the word nuclei is in the central nervous system, and the word ganglia is in the peripheral nervous system. I'm not going to ask you any questions on the specific nuclei themselves. Those are not important. But what is important is that these nuclei control muscle movement. They control emotion. They control the ability to do something you've done before, to ride a bike, to play the piano, to play the violin, to play baseball. They're very, very important clusters of neurons. And there are a few diseases of these nuclei that you should know. Really, basically one. I want you to know Parkinson's disease, because Parkinson's disease is a common disease of the elderly, and it involves a problem with these nuclei, You don't have to worry about Huntington's disease. Huntington's disease is very rare, but Parkinson's disease is very common, and it is a disorder of the basal nuclei. And we'll talk more about it as we go on, okay? Parkinson's disease, all right? We are now leaving the cerebrum, and we're going into the diencephalon. The diencephalon is composed of three paired gray matter structures: the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the epithalamus. And all three of them enclose the third ventricle. We're now talking about involuntary function. You cannot control it. Here is the diencephalon. It is the thalamus, the epithalamus, and the hypothalamus. All right? The diencephalon. Involuntary control. The thalamus. The thalamus is an egg-shaped nucleus in the third ventricle. This is what I want you to know about the thalamus. It is a relay station. It is a relay station for information coming into the cerebral cortex. It sorts, it edits, and it relays sensory input into the cortex. If you have an upset stomach, it will relay that information to the brain itself. If you are dizzy, it will relay the information to the cortex. It is also involved in memory. Overall, it acts to mediate sensation, to mediate motor activity, to mediate cortical arousal. It mediates learning. It mediates memory. It is a relay station, the thalamus. The hypothalamus, hypo means below, it is below the thalamus. It is probably one of the most important parts of your diencephalon. The hypothalamus is the main visceral control and regulating center that is vital to homeostasis. It controls your autonomic nervous system. It controls your blood pressure. It controls your heartbeat. It controls the way you digest food. It controls the size of your pupil. It controls emotion. It is part of the limbic system. The limbic system is the area of your brain which perceives emotion. It perceives pleasure, fear, rage, whether you're sleeping 8 hours or less, and your sex drive. The hypothalamus is involved in your entire homeostatic control. It regulates body temperature. It regulates hunger. It regulates water balance and thirst. And it regulates your sleep and awake cycles. It controls your endocrine system. You'll learn in Bio 114 that it secretes its own hormones. And it also controls the master gland of your body, which is the pituitary gland, which has the rest of the hormones. So the hypothalamus is an important function in your homeostatic control of your entire body. All right? It's very rare to have a tumor of it. Don't worry about that. What I want you to know about the hypothalamus is that it controls your autonomic nervous system. All the involuntary functions that you have is controlled by the hypothalamus. The epithalamus has one function, and that one function is in the pineal gland. And the pineal gland secretes a hormone called melatonin that helps regulate your sleep and awake cycle. It is your biological clock. The pineal gland secretes melatonin, which controls your biological clock. And if you have trouble sleeping, you can go to a vitamin store and you can buy melatonin to help you sleep. That is the diencephalon. Now we drop into the brainstem. The brainstem has three parts: the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata, always called the medulla. It is also involuntary. It controls automatic behavior necessary for your survival. And the majority of your cranial nerves come from the brainstem. And we'll talk about cranial nerves on Wednesday. The brainstem, the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla. Don't worry about the peduncles, but again, you see the word cerebral aqueduct. Cerebral aqueduct is a channel full of cerebral spinal fluid that runs through the midbrain and connects the third and fourth ventricles. The one important thing in the midbrain is the substantia nigra, the black substance. Nigra meaning black, substantia meaning substance, the black substance. It is functionally linked to the 3 basal nuclei. Inside of this substantia nigra is a neurotransmitter called dopamine. When you lack dopamine in the substantia nigra turns white and you get Parkinson's disease. So Parkinson's disease is a degeneration of the substantia nigra of the midbrain because of a lack of dopamine. And the treatment of Parkinson's disease is to give you dopamine. That's what I want you to know about Parkinson's disease. The pons. The pons is located between the midbrain and the medulla. The one thing I want you to know about the pons is that there are some cranial nerves that come from the pons. You don't have to know the exact ones, but what's very important about the pons is that it controls rhythmic, normal breathing. Again, the pons controls rhythmic and normal breathing patterns. The medulla. The medulla is the posterior part of the midbrain. It blends into the spinal cord at the foramen magnum. It contains the choroid plexus. The choroid plexus is where the spinal fluid is made. The choroid plexus is where the spinal fluid is made. The structures of medulla are important, and these two are very important, the pyramids and the decussation. The pyramids are ridges formed by tracts of axons, pyramidal tracts, from the motor cortex. The decussation is important because this is where the point where the tracks cross over to the opposite side. This is where you have all of the white matter tracks that cross over. This is where the control of the lateralization is important, right here at the decussation. There are cranial nerves that come from the medulla. That's not important. What is important about the medulla are its functions. It controls your heart. It controls the force and the rate of heart contractions. It also controls your blood pressure. Very, very important. It's an involuntary control. An involuntary control. Also, along with the pons, has a respiratory center. And if the pons controls normal respiration, the medulla controls the rate and depth of breathing. The ability to breathe faster, the ability to hold your breath is in the medulla. Normal respiration is in the pons. And it also controls other things. It controls vomiting, hiccuping, swallowing, coughing, and sneezing. But importantly, it controls the rate and depth of breathing itself. We now go into the cerebellum. The word cerebellum means little brain. Okay, it is located below the pons and below the medulla. It has a major role in balance. Cerebellum controls your balance. Okay? If you drink too much alcohol, it's hard to walk because your cerebellum has been poisoned by alcohol and you have problems walking a straight line. That's why when you are driving drunk and the policeman picks you up, gets you out and says, walk a straight line, the alcohol affects the cerebellum and you cannot walk a straight line because you have poisoned your cerebellar balancing function. Okay? The only word on this slide that I want you to know is arbor vitae, the tree of life. If you cut into the cerebellum, you will see a thin cortex of gray matter that looks like a tree when it attaches to white matter. And it will look like this. This is arbor vitae, the tree of life. This is what it looks like. Know that. Not much more I want you to know about the cerebellum besides balance and arbor vitae. I think we're done. We are. Good. I know this was a lot of material